Our periodization project is on triphasic training. I'm Trevor Roberts, and my partners who will be speaking later are Stephen Gonzalez and Benjamin Gonzalez. Triphasic training was made by strength and conditioning coach Cal Dietz, who has been working with numerous athletic programs at the University of Minnesota since 2000. He also works with some men's and women's U.S. Olympic teams. Cal Dietz came up with triphasic training in 2003 when he noticed that two of his track and field throwing athletes, they had similar builds, similar maxes on their lifts, yet for some reason one of the athletes was greatly outthrowing the other. So what he decided to do was test their bench presses by using a force plate, and discovered that when looking at this power time graph on the slide, the athlete with the better throw, we'll just call him Ben in this blue line on the graph, he could absorb more force eccentrically at a higher velocity. So in other words, his eccentric phase on the bench was faster and stronger, and this subsequently caused him to concentrically move the bar faster and produce more power than the other athlete, Tommy, who is the red line on this graph. He decelerated and accelerated the bar at a slower velocity. As a result, Dietz formulated his idea or basis of triphasic training, which its primary goal is to increase power production by placing a training emphasis on the three muscle actions in sequential daily undulating blocks. So what I mean by that is that first block, we're going to be placing an emphasis on the eccentric portion of the lift. Then we're going to move on to the next block, which is going to place an emphasis on the isometric portion of that lift. And then that final block, we put it all in together by working on the concentric portion, right? So why would we want to do this? Well, by working on these muscle actions in ordered blocks, the athlete can start off by improving their eccentric and isometric phases, which will allow them to absorb more force at a higher velocity. In other words, be more like this blue line here in the illuminated box on this power time graph. And then that's going to result in an enhanced stretch reflex, which subsequently should improve their rate of force development and power output. In other words, improve their concentric phase and be more like the blue line here to the right of this illuminated box on the graph. So all in all, we should see improvements in the three muscle actions, which is going to make the V, as you can see on this power time graph, more narrow. And that's indicative of a faster, more powerful stretch shortening cycle, which is extremely crucial for when we're talking about most team sports athletes or power athletes who need to produce a lot of force in a short period of time during dynamic actions such as sprinting, jumping, or throwing. So what problems does triphasic training solve, and what are the benefits of it? Well, let's first look at some problems associated with poor power production. And remember, before I start, poor maximal strength isn't always going to be the problem, because when looking at those two throwers Dietz studied, they had similar maxes on their lifts, yet one of them had worse power production. And so in terms of that worse power production, oftentimes the problem lies in the fact that that athlete has a weaker and slower eccentric and isometric phase. And so when those two phases are weak and slow, then they're probably not going to initiate as great of a stretch reflex response, and then that hinders, it's going to lower their rate of force development and power output. Put everything all together, and we're going to, on this power time graph, like this red line, we're going to see a wider V. And that wider V is more representative of a longer stretch shortening cycle, and that's what we don't want to see in terms of power production. And then one more thing I want to note is you're almost never usually going to see someone eccentrically contract slow like this red line and then explode out fast concentrically like the blue line. Each phase kind of feeds off of each other. Another problem is other periodization programs and or trainers tend to focus solely on concentric phase development, without consideration of working on or placing an emphasis on the eccentric and isometric portions of a lift. And so triphasic training works to solve those problems by Again, to reiterate, having dedicated sequential blocks to each muscle action for the sole purpose of working on those factors that are going to improve power production.
Implementation of the triphasic system using a 3-day model. The triphasic system is comprised of 3 phases, each utilizing a daily undulating block cycle. Phase 1, or accumulation, lasts 2 to 6 weeks and further subdivides into 3 2 to 3 week blocks, each emphasizing a particular muscle action: eccentric, isometric, and concentric. Phase 2, or transmutation, follows and typically lasts 3 to 4 weeks. Finally, phase 3, or realization, also more commonly known as peaking, lasts 2 weeks. The triphasic system is intended to begin in the off-season, but can be adjusted to fit almost any time of year, and the author provides many online resources to facilitate this. Residual effects of training, or RTEs, play an important role in the triphasic system. Essentially, the blocks are sequenced in a way where the benefits of training transfer over into the next block, with the abilities trained early on having the longest lasting RTEs, while the abilities emphasized near the end possess the shortest lived RTEs. The accumulation phase is the longest of the 3 phases, with the goal of developing general athleticism within the realms of aerobic endurance and maximal strength. In all blocks, there is a high emphasis on quality over quantity, with most rep schemes for the big lifts operating in the 1 to 3 range in order to limit neurological fatigue. Accumulation further subdivides into 3 phases that can be adjusted in length at the coach's desire based on athletic performance. Specialized methods are implemented during training sessions that essentially acts as supersets to the compound lifts. The goal is to maximize the time allotted for training in addition to keeping the CNS active and improving intramuscular coordination. Methods vary according to the block, but French contrast, prehab, and oscillatory variations are included in almost all blocks. Traditional retesting of 1RMs doesn't occur during the mesocycle. Instead, a system of warming up to 80% of an athlete's 1RM and then utilizing the coach's discretion in regards to athlete performance of the lift is implemented. Resources are provided to give the coach approximations for where the athlete's new 1RM may be based on the coach's observations and their level of experience. Block 1 of the first phase, or eccentric development, emphasis on improving the stretch reflex while inhibiting the Golgi tendon organs in order to facilitate better deceleration mechanics. The author strongly suggests some guidelines for his phases, this one in particular. Novice athletes should only use eccentric methods with compound lifts, but as they and the coach gain experience, eccentrics can be added to accessory lifts. Eccentrics should never be performed above 85%, given the high risk of injury associated with this. Spotters are mandatory given the difficulty and taxing nature of the lifts. And finally, eccentric lifts should always end explosively. Even if realistically the lift doesn't look explosive, the athlete should begin to train their CNS to accelerate as fast as possible. Block 2, or isometric development, emphasis on improving neurological mechanisms that manage motor unit recruitment and rate coding, which should assist the athlete in transferring energy effectively between the eccentric and concentric phases of a lift. Rules that apply to this phase in particular: the coach should implement isometrics as they apply to the athlete's sport. As the author argues, transferability only occurs within a 5 to 10 degree window. Athletes should hit the ground or isometric phase of the lift, quote, like a brick. Goal is to not gradually decelerate into the isometric phase, but enter into it as quickly as possible. The coach should use isometric drills during the warm-up to facilitate the athlete's adaptation to sustained isometric phases. Spotters are again mandatory, and lifts should always end as explosively as possible. Block 3, or concentric development, the most familiar phase of the triphasic system for most athletes. Goal is to, quote, maximize energy transfer from preceding eccentric and isometric phases into a unified, explosive, dynamic lift. A new specialized method called AFSM is implemented, but it will be addressed later in phase 3, block 5. Simple rules this time around: train fast. Or, to put it another way, all 3 phases of the lift should occur reactively, or as fast as possible, without sacrificing quality. For a general overview of this phase, and this applies to succeeding phases as well, just with altered variables like percentages, but Mondays are medium intensity, heavy load, Wednesdays are high intensity, reactive, and Fridays are high volume, low intensity. Mondays may include cluster sets at the coach's discretion, whereby 2 to 3 reps are performed, followed by 10 to 20 seconds of rest, followed by another 2 to 3 reps. This is intended to reduce fatigue while increasing density. Typical tempos involve a 6-centric eccentric phase or a 3-second isometric phase for their particular blocks. On Wednesdays, assistant exercises are performed at similar high intensities, with the exception of plyometrics, which are inherently associated with high forces and thus loads. Fridays are meant to be low intensity, high volume with the idea that increased blood flow to the targeted areas will facilitate recovery over the weekend. Athletes in season will omit Fridays from their schedule as practice should give them enough volume as is. Eccentrics and isometrics are implemented by reduced values. No tempos will be used on assisted exercises, and French contrast is avoided for fear of overtraining. Exercises will be selected as less stressful variants of the big lifts performed on the preceding Monday. Second phase, transmutation, or block 4, the speed strength phase. Lower percentages with slightly higher volume, but still quality over quantity. More emphasis on optimization of CNS and sport-specific motor abilities. Bar speed becomes the primary metric of performance during this phase, and given the emphasis on CNS development, residuals have a shorter window. Relating to bar speed, timed drop-off sets are implemented via a Tendo unit or a stopwatch depending on availability. The coach will establish a time duration for the athlete to perform an established number of reps, by which the athlete will continue to perform sets of reps with quality until they can no longer perform them within the time threshold. Once that happens, further sets are terminated and the athlete moves on to the next station. A 24 to 72 hour break from that particular lift will be allotted depending on the magnitude of failure to meet threshold. Phase 2 or block 4 is similar to phase 1, but with lower intensities and French contrast exercise selection that is specific to an athlete's sport. Mondays are still medium intensity with an emphasis on bar speed, while Wednesdays are still maximal high intensity days. Fridays are again low intensity, high volume, but now with the suggestion of implementing novel training modalities in order to keep athlete engagement high. Athletes in season will again omit Fridays from their training schedules.
The third phase is realization phase, block 5, or better known as the peaking phase, with the primary goal of prepping the athlete for competition and having them at a high level of readiness. It's typically the shortest phase of the 3, lasting about 2 weeks. And ideally, the residuals from the previous 2 phases are still active and athletes operating at a high level of performance, meaning that this is the phase where accumulation and transmutation will transfer and be used by an athlete in an explosive and powerful manner. Typically, it's a low intensity with loads ranging from 25 to 55% of 1 RM, with the goal of teaching an athlete to contract, relax, agonist, antagonist muscle groups as rapidly as possible. Authors insist that at 3 days optimal, rather than a 4 to 6 day, because it might result in any overtraining, any overstress, and we want to have our athlete in peak mode to ensure full recovery and have them ready, fresh and recovered for practice. In phase 3, we'll utilize time domains instead of reps. The domains are going to fluctuate between the days depending on the intensity, and the domains should mimic that of the intensity of the sport of the athlete. For example, soccer, which is more of endurance, will be a lot longer durations rather than a shot putter whose durations are going to be a lot less. And exercise selections should mimic that of the movement patterns of the athlete and the range of motion present in the athlete's sport. And velocity of training should operate within sport-specific ranges of motion in order to optimally train CNS. Phase 3 utilizes specialized methods. The primary one is as AFSM, antagonistically facilitated specialized methods of training. ASFM helps athletes relax, contract at higher velocities, and use at velocities that are close to competition. Essentially, to transfer the gains for the athletes from weight room to competition. And here we use examples of plyometrics, shock variations, oscillations, high velocity strength training. So plyometrics are anything that uses the stretch shortening cycle to increase forward output during the concentric phase. Shock uses dropping from heights of 12 inches or greater, followed by a short ground contact, which is less than 0.2 seconds, as quickly as possible prior to the concentric phase. And high velocities, strength training uses resistance training loads of 55% or less, which mimics that similar to plyometrics, which will result in a quicker bar velocity, which will increase in force output. And oscillations, there are 2 advantages and disadvantage variants performed under time domain with a 4 to 6 inch range of motion, and is designed to, and I quote, improve intermuscular coordination and facilitate high velocity relaxation, which should improve performance. Mondays are the medium intensity days with loads from 35 to 40%, and time durations are ideal and relative to that of the sport athlete. Wednesdays are more high intensity days with time domains below the level of activity duration. And then Fridays are low intensity, low days with lows of 25 to 35%, but time domains higher than ideal for the athlete sport. Next, we're going to give you a quick rundown of how to read the triphasic sample. So on our top left, we have circled our athletes 1RM, which is 300 pounds. And below are going to be the exercises that are paired with each other. So the bench press paired with medicine ball chest pass, paired with 30-second rest, and then you have the infraspinatus exercise. So just quick note, if there is no pair with, then that exercise alone is going to be done by itself. And then move on to the next one by itself. And then next we have our reps that are going to be done one after each other. On our top right, we have our load. So on Monday, it's going to be our medium intensity. So anywhere between 225 to 240. And on our right in the middle, we have our sets. And then on our bottom right, we have any notes that are included that the coach might add, but mainly are going to be our tempos. Here we have a 2-second isometric hold. So here is our eccentric above 80%. So this is our block 1. As you can see, we have our exercises, our instructions, or any specific instructions, our notes. Just want to make a quick note for Monday, which is more of our medium intensity. So our loads going to be in medium intensity. We have our eccentric tempos. Wednesdays are more high intensity, lower volumes. You can see we only have about a few reps, a few sets. And then Fridays are more of our lower intensity, higher volume with our tempos. And then next we have our block 2, which is our isometric. So here, again, we have our specific instructions. And then you can see for our sports back squat, you have the isometric hold for 5 seconds, which are more Mondays are higher intensity, medium intensity, medium volume. Wednesdays, higher intensity, lower volume. You can see our few reps, few sets. And then Friday, you can see our tempo, which would be a lower intensity, higher volume. Here we have our block 3 of our concentric above 80%. As you can see, again, we have our exercises. Everything's pretty much the same. Our loads are about medium intensity, medium volume. Here you can see our 4 double zeros on our third sports back squat. 4 double zeros, which indicates our concentric. We're going to go quickly down. We're going to go quickly up. Following what we have our medium intensity, medium volume, higher intensity on Wednesdays, lower volume. And then Fridays, where we have our lower intensity, higher volume.
Triphasic training lacks academic research to support or refute its efficacy. After doing a lot of research, we only found one peer-reviewed scientific research study that analyzed triphasic training. And to quickly summarize that study, their triphasic group outperformed their control group in all of the dependent variables that they studied. And what the control group did was they just continued their exercise routines with no added instructions. So yeah, this is supporting triphasic training, but at the same time, this is just merely one article, so we can't say that there's a sufficient amount of research out there to back the use of triphasic training. But on the other side of the spectrum, we can't say that there's evidence out there denying the use of triphasic training. So that just goes back to my first point in saying that it lacks academic research to support or refute its efficacy. The following are common criticisms made by experts in the field. So some didn't like how it lacked research and relied on anecdotal evidence. Some said it's too complex of a training method, and therefore they argue that it's something they would only use for their advanced lifters, and maybe it's not as applicable for their beginner lifters, such as a high school athlete with no prior lifting experience. Also, we found someone say that triphasic training may not be ideal for in-season training since there are a lot of physiological side effects that come along with eccentric training, such as increased muscle damage, soreness, and neural fatigue. And then lastly, someone argued that they typically see better speed results from their advanced athletes when they perform more speed training. And therefore, triphasic training wouldn't be that helpful since the priority there is on more weight training instead of doing just more speed training.